Hey, Ashwin.
Hey, Prashant. The recording is on. I think it looks like when I join it, automatic start.
Okay, that's fine.
And Dan pinged me that a few of them probably late for 30 minutes. So they might only be join at 9:30, looks like.
Got you. So I wanted to discuss one major question that is like, can we have something intermediate and have a phased approach? Should I park that as a question for later half an hour then? What do you
We'll
think?
see how that goes, yeah. But we
Oh,
cannot,
okay.
yeah. We probably cannot just wait for 30 minutes. We just go with the normal flow and we'll see.
Yeah. I was just thinking of moving. So basically, I did some research and I put the agenda items here. So I was just thinking that should I move the first one in the later one? What do you
Yeah, you can adjust your order, yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Roland, hi, Kevin. I was just telling Prashant that
Because
Dan said the few from their side they probably be late for 30 minutes. But we can start as normal. That they will join late.
Share my screen as well. Hey, nice to see you, Laurent. From tab, entire screen 2. Yes.
how wide is your monitor?
27-inch. I think that is what it is. Standard one.
But like isn't that like ultra wide?
Oh yeah, ultra wide. Yeah.
Yeah, because like it's
Yeah, I
not
could
the regular ratio. Like
Hey,
Yeah.
Kevin, are you jealous?
yeah, I am. I used to have one of those at the office. It's like one of those like is it curved too? It's like
Yes,
yeah.
it's curved too. Yeah.
I can tell from the length or the width of your screen.
Wow. One can say so much about that, but just a screen share is interesting. How much we can reverse engineer. It's interesting. Let me send this link to the chat as well. So we'll discuss this more, but here's what I did on a high level. That I did some research on what are the predefined masks look like and on some of the known services that supports masking. And I wanted to know and discuss more about like what are our thoughts about this in general. So let's give like 2 more minutes to see if more folks join. Otherwise, we can start thinking on what do we want to do in this front. Okay, so I believe I should start now, Let me see if there are more people.
Yeah, I think we about can start. Yeah, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dan said they will join at around 9:30. We can start.
So I think one of the things that we were discussing is like, uh, referencing to the existing policy stores such as Ranger. So Ranger like model that we have has predefined masks. So basically in the Ranger UI, you can select like redact, partial mask, and the engine accordingly just applies the mask in the background, right? So there are some predefined masks in Ranger like redact, show last for, show first for, hash and nullify and stuff like that. And obviously the custom masks are like proper UDFs. That we have the plan of anyways to do. So earlier, last time we were discussing about like, do we need to have like a defined action, or should we have new transforms, or should we say that, okay, we have predefined UDFs, like what do we want to do? So actually I had a question for Dan on this construct. So basically it felt like that we have discussed and debated like there is pros and cons for both the things, and it does not hurt if you want to do something like that. But Dan gave a feedback that uh, he does not want to enumerate specific action in retrospect, and then hence I did more research to know like what is something as currently present in the ecosystem, like what can we all do in context of that, and why like predefined actions can be helpful. But once we define a predefined action, should we define a predefined transform, or should we just specify the text what the action means and then expect the engines to use the corresponding functions they want to do? So this is what the debate is currently. So as the course of that, I took an action item to do more researches on the system that we have predefined mask for. So the closest and what inspired like this predefined mask action is something like this, like of a Ranger kind of an experience where you just say, okay, redact. Redact has a well-defined meaning of int, float, string data types, and this is how you redact. Similarly for last for, first for, hash, and nullify. We have a transform for nullify. We have transforms for hash also. I mean, but I think it's bucket transform if I'm not mistaken. Uh, but and we also have a transform for first in. We don't have for last in, and we don't have anything defined for redact. So as a course of that, this PR specifies these three actions. Okay, mask with short 256, replace with null, which I think Lawrence feedback is to replace with word transform. That's fine. Then there is something called mask alphanumeric. That's how we are modeling actions against. So Ranger is one such thing. I also did a research on Microsoft SQL Server. Apparently, they also support like some predefined masks, which you can just attach to your system. For example, there is something called email mask, which has a predefined meaning, and you can just say that, okay, refer to this email mask, and it just means that, okay, whatever definition of email is, they will just apply that. Similarly, for the default one, they have a fixed definition of what this means, and similarly for random. Then in Postgres, I came across this anonymous anonymizer as a like Postgres extension. It also has some set of predefined functions. The implementation clearly, so the function definition clearly says what it means, and when you install this extension, you can literally label it and define which mask you want to apply for this function for. But bottom line being, this function is well defined in what this is going to mean when you attach this to a mask in a column. So this is where this debate is. I wanted to keep or bring this up on what do we think about having a predefined action for this, and should we have masks or should we have a defined transform for it? Yeah, Laurent, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think one interesting thing is that like we are not discussing the one which are not in that list. Like if you look at like, I mean, I'm calling like number like Snowflakes, Dremio, Databricks, Unity, and stuff. They don't have like a predefined list. They allow basically to apply functions. And I guess there's like other systems as well. So like, I'm not sure I want to start as part of that conversation just to have like the spec now in terms of like that becomes a conversation about like, oh, like why this function and not this function, or like why do we want anything and stuff, because I think everybody will come with like their favorite functions, and that will become like easily a mess. So I would want like to like following back on, I mean, on the last conversation, we said like a few actions for like the thing and stuff. Like I would start with that. I would try to come with like the EDF integration as fast as possible and see how things evolve from there. And let's get the spec approved so we can move on, at least in terms of like starting implementing that at the catalog and engine level. But like I'm just afraid like if we start discussing like the various models of each like database and stuff, and like hey, like we need to import these functions, that will basically balloon and we will basically delay or store the conversation on the spec to a private transformation. That's what I'm afraid of, like by discussing that, to be honest.
That makes sense, honestly. But the thing is that it's not either we want to do this or we want to do that. We are saying that can both exist. For example, can we say that can the defined actions be there? Is the feedback here that hey, if you define something of this custom, then platform providers like Snowflake, Databricks will not be able to enforce it? Is that a concern, or like what precisely is the concern of like allowing this in addition to allowing the transforms?
I mean, there's definitely that, because now like it's a form of dialect in a way. Like I mean,
yes,
dialect just focus on functions, but like which we'll have a custom question for DF, and so that's why I mean like like if you are doing something at the spec level, it's like that's becoming, I think, hard. Also, like if like everything is encoded directly into the spec, the number of function level definitions, it means also like each time a very long and hard process. And so that's because of the cost of the process, basically people will be like really like pushy on those things and stuff. So I mean, like I said, like honestly, like in my original comments was more like, oh, like try to come with like the few functions which we think are really important, add them as like transform, and like the set of functions which you can apply to fine grained access control versus like partition transform is well defined, and we know that, and like maybe like a separate documentation page about like, hey, here's the function definitions which are supported for those like as recognized by Iceberg and the definition, versus like being put that in the spec doc, the OpenAPI spec, because like that's not something people I mean would actually like if you use the OpenAPI client, doesn't really help on implementing that. But like now, if you start saying, oh, like here's like the function for Ranger, if you start the function for SQL Server and PG and MySQL and stuff, like people say, oh, like they're like quite the same, but not. I mean, they're similar, but not quite the same. So we need both. And for the corrections, like yeah, like, what am I doing? Like, if I just too many of them, too many dialects, and like for me, like it may. I mean, if Ryan wanted to push to have a bit of support, I think like if you're adding too much of these functions, it will basically push away engines to adopt them and move away, like move to a UDF as the only supported option. So that may be paradoxal, but like I'm just afraid like yeah, just too many things, too many validations.
I see. So taking one step at a time, you are okay with defining it as a named transform and then referencing directly transform as part of the restriction that we want to apply against that column to get the transform value or the masked value. The only thing you're not okay with is like defining it as an action, which is a pure text definition, right? Is that correct? Sorry, it's a direct question to you, Laurent.
I'm okay. My preference is toward transform. Action, I could live with that. What I'm really against is that like starting making it like a large list of functions. Okay,
that's a fair feedback on that. But okay, that's something that we can discuss more. That okay, do we want to define a transform for that?
Steven has an option.
Yeah. I was just concluding this so that I can give it to Steven. But Steven, please go ahead.
Yeah, can you open up the PR that you have?
Yes.
Because when I look at the diff, the diff, seems like you list 3, but the apply transform is kind of like a catch-all for.
Yes.
But the other 3 can also be captured by apply transform, is it?
Yes. I mean, if we define a transform for these functions, these can be defined as a transform here. So if we define a transform for this, these actions can be consumed within transform, and then we can just have an action that applies a transform, and then we can have a action later on that applies an expression, which in turn can reference a UDF. So that was the idea.
I
But
guess
the
that's
main,
probably where the Laurent and the dance maybe come from. Hey, if we have that genetic transform using Iceberg expression UDF, why do we have to list those specific out? But I think we can probably work on to add those missing pieces to the Iceberg expression or UDF.
Mhm. Yes. So, okay. Wait, who raised their hand? Kevin, yeah, please go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, go ahead. You finish your thoughts first.
Yes. So my thoughts were, and I think this is where when we were adding the actions for this was like, okay, why do we want to go into the middle of defining a transform for this function? Like, for example, this is a well-defined thing that an engine needs to do. Can we leave this to the engine to apply this action on their own? Now, there can be ways to apply this, like an engine can just say that, okay, I understand this action, I can perform this action, and I can do what it takes. Our engine can just bail out because we're talking about, okay, the engine understands it. If it does not understand it's by contract, it needs to fail. So the question was that do we need to define a transform for it, or we can just say, okay, this is an action that an engine needs to perform, and this is what that action means. So that's where was transform seemed to be according to seems to be like, okay, we don't need to say per se have a transform for SHA-256 because each engine know what SHA-256 means. And if we clearly define that, okay, this is what SHA-256 means, then engine can just apply it at their planner layer, this transformation. So that was one of the thought process, Steve, just to tell you why we had this in the first place.
Yeah, just quick send people to Kevin. So, but if we define those as Iceberg expression or let's say the non-UDF, I probably can achieve similar goal.
Yes. Yes. If we define it as a transform, we will achieve the same thing. If we define it by a expression referencing UDFs, that will also achieve same thing. But I think the problem will will remain. I don't know how the dialect problem is solved in solved in UDF. Yeah.
Yeah, secret UDF is a little more inconvenient to use. I think the expression will be easier for engine to use for sure.
Exactly. Yeah. So that was one of the thought process. Kevin, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to summarize the discussion in my head. So I think the idea here is that we were adding these I guess what's it called, like
actions,
actions, masks, or like these almost like implementations, because we want a consistent implementation across engines, right?
Yes.
Like there's not a like there's no value if it's not consistent across engines, right?
Yes.
But I guess taking a step back, I think the concern here is also, from a spec writing perspective, like what is just the right amount to put in the spec, right?
Yes.
And I guess there's two parts here. One is, okay, we want this idea of finer grain access control in IRC, right?
Yes.
We want to introduce that idea into IRC, but this idea also carries with it a bunch of these actions. So it's like, how can we, like, where in that line do we split so that it still works as a spec for IRC while allow us to like start defining these actions, and maybe that's a good place to draw the line. And it goes back to like what Stephen was saying, right, with like the apply transform, right? Like I think from a spec angle, it's like, okay, well, you need to support this functionality, right? You need to support the ability to apply some kind of transformation. And then we can alternatively define a centralized list of actions somehow, right? I think we're trying to do both here, and I understand why, because like you can't really have the value of finer grain access control without having both. But I think the feedback, I think Lauren touched on this point too, is that like where do we draw the line, right? Like how do we get this in the spec? Does that make sense? I think that's how I'm thinking about it in my head on this discussion.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think one thing we potentially can do in the REST spec, we just define apply transform. But I think in the table spec, they also define the list of expression Iceberg support. Maybe we can work on expand that expression to add some of those things like for the masking.
Yeah,
that might be one way to go.
Yeah, because at this point in the
What do you think of that? Lauren, what do you think of?
Oh, sorry, but I wasn't sure what question passed on me. Yeah, I would be okay. I would be okay with that.
Yeah. So here, if you'll see, we have a fixed set of defined transforms that we
It's
have.
not a fix, it's actually examples.
Yeah, actually, that's true.
It's actually freeform.
Well,
but
I mean,
table spec
in the API spec, if you go to the table spec document, like that we have like a list of transform, and like doesn't seem like you could have like a document for fine-grained access, which lists basically like the functions and how to apply the guidelines for engines, like what makes good security things, like the things for example. So that's why I'm saying like the model of like having the YAML like be like more freeform, because anyway the client cannot really do anything about like interpreting the transform. It has to be like an engine thing, and so they make like a more complete document, like at the same level as the table spec for implementers on both catalog and engine size, but like the meaning of these transformations. That's what we could put them at the table. I guess I can make like good partition transformation as well, most of them. But like in practice, people use that. I don't know.
Maybe you can generalize this just transform, doesn't have to partition transform, and partition can use some of them, right? Doesn't have to be all. Maybe that's one way we can get. Let's see, we can say circulate this idea to see how people think.
Okay, no, that's fair. I mean, see, the thing is that one of the reasons of this is like we can have a transforms page and then say that okay, partition transform references these transforms from this, and Iceberg also generalizes on defining transforms. But I think there is something like before we generalize on this transform, that do we agree on we should have predefined transforms or predefined masks? And once we agree with the fact that there can be predefined masks, then we can agree on how do we represent those masks, like whether it should be an action, whether it should be a predefined transform. I'm assuming from this discussion so far in this group that we agree that there can be some predefined mask and that can be represented in one way or the other. Now the representation is what we are talking about. That
but
is
like if you're using transform as is, and if you are basically bootstrapping the table transformations, it means that you already have like masking actions. I mean, some of them are like maybe like that, but like they're like or like in a way reduce the scope, or like except for identity, I guess. But like now we can discuss having, do we need like to add like extra one, like the end of the string, like the suffix function, or like the only like I don't know, like trying to remember like the name, sorry, of the actions. But like that's fair. But like maybe like one or two, like I'm not sure. Like I mean, I would go like what I'm afraid, like I said again, like is going crazy on adding a lot of transforms, like to match like the whole range of like what are supported out there.
I think adding the predefined masking transform or expression makes sense to me. I assume those can cover maybe 70 or 80% of the use cases for masking, right?
Yes.
So I think have those commonly defined sims, and those are not complicated ones, right? They can be easily supported by Iceberg expression.
Yes. There can be they can be very well be supported by Iceberg expression. In fact, I think we already have like a transform for first 4 characters or first n or last n, if I'm not mistaken. There is already a transform like that.
Truncate.
Truncate. Yeah, truncate.
The last n.
Yeah. So we already have a transform like that. So it's easy to like generalize on this. There are rough edges like how do you truncate like a fixed size to 16, or let's say a given value, like binary types and fixed length are still fine, but how can you truncate it appropriately that you don't break it in the middle? like these are rough edges that truncate transform defines on its implementation. We can define those implementation and we can have a consistent portability on that. Okay, so the way I'm assuming that, okay, I think it was known that we would be able to define transform, and for all the actions that we are trying to do, it's just that we didn't want it to. But I think it seems like we are inclining more towards like, okay, having a defined transform, let me float this idea to like the general to get the general consensus. For me, I think I'm fine either ways. The major thing that was like coming to me as an action, because the thing that I had in mind was this example, like, okay, if user is Prashant, then apply this masking transform, I'll give the value as it is. And then we are also talking about like server-side context evaluation. So essentially for this particular column, we will be for that principal giving mask hash 256 as a value. Now it's totally up to on Iceberg on how it wants to apply that value. Should it be, you can just call hash lib of 256 and it will be open to the interpretation from Iceberg point of view. And Spark can similarly, if Spark is consuming this, Spark will do the SHA-256 function there. Currently, because UDFs are SQL dialect, but if we have a transform which says that, okay, do a SHA-256, that's a transform definition itself. At this point also, correct me, Kevin, if I'm missing something, that Iceberg can apply those transform as defined in Iceberg spec. So those things will be still achievable, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the hash function transform is in the spec, right?
Okay.
Like it's following that paragraph in the spec.
Okay.
And that's the table spec, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So what we are saying is that, okay, table spec, so far we already had the use case of table spec. What Steven is saying is that, okay, let's have a dedicated transform space, transform as a specification. Then table partition transforms reference to some of the transforms, and fine-grained access control will reference some of the transforms, and that will what we will go about and see this.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
Defined.
So I guess going back to the discussion about having
Yeah.
consistent definitions for transforms, instead of like, one way is we define a bunch of EDFs, and when we do define a bunch of EDFs, you have to make sure all the syntax is it supports all the different syntax. I guess the other option is you go into the table spec and you define expressions or transforms there, and then you can reference those instead.
Yes.
Like, for example, the hash function right now, it's for transformation, right?
Yes.
And we have truncate as well, and we'll just like expand on that.
Mhm.
So I guess coming back to this spec PR, what that means is we need a way to like reference transforms and a way to like apply transforms, right? And then we don't define what those transformations are. We kind of delegate it to somewhere else.
I mean, the thing is that once we start defining those transform there, people will be using those transforms to define the policy. Right? Now, once the policy is defined that references that predefined transform, this is just the evaluation result that is something that we are trying to give back. So the thing is that we need to standardize on the transform so that the policy definition can reference the transform, because the other way around will be a bit problematic. Now, once we do that, then it's fine. So I think that will be the way to go about on like defining transform, then catalogs or the policy stores referencing those transforms in their policy definition, or have some way to reverse map it in the best way possible, and then giving the results back. Yeah, you can.
Yeah, I think policy itself is not necessarily part of the final policy decision. Of course, be consistent always the best thing we can do, but policy itself could be anything that is not limited to the transform or UDF, which within the definition of Iceberg spec that to define the finer stuff. Policy could be quite flexible when coming to the multiple system OPA or Ranger or any other customer policy system like Google's one could be completely different. Then we just need a consistent way to express the policy decisions which we are working on here. I think in terms of the transform, I have a little minor concern. So the transform, what we use for the partition is quite a specific. Means once you make the decision to go with one. So I'm joining a little bit later, but the question I have is if we decide to say okay, we're gonna use this as well, like we're gonna standardize this part, then everything here, of course, we can use, but it's still quite limited functionality in terms of the expressions. How do we express well for certain, especially for certain final grant or like the manipulation, more complex manipulation of the string or any data. So it quite limit. Are we consider this is a complementary, or we consider UDF as the main points where we can do more expressive transform instead of we attach these transform? Like, is it? I just wanted to be mindful, like when we make this decision, is this the right direction we want to go to? Stephen?
Yeah, I think if the, let's say if the function is pretty common or pretty widely accepted and also not so complicated, I think then the put into the Iceberg expression probably is can easy to achieve the consistency cross engines. But if the complicated and we don't know if the widely accepted, maybe leave the UDF can be option. I think probably we just have to decide how much value, how common this kind of use. For example, the masking, some of the masking policy that expression that the person listed, that I guess they're probably pretty common use. And also we just saying we're gonna list we can expand the transform expression list, but not all of them can be used by partition. Partition may be only limited to subset. Yeah, not all these transform will be used by partition. Let's say we define 15, maybe 10 we think it's allowed for partition. Other 5 transforms for other purposes, like read restriction. Yeah, that's all for me.
Yeah, I'll go next on this. So if the idea is that like some systems have predefined set of transforms, and at this point you can directly attach a transform to a column. Now there are two type of complex policies that I can think of. The one which references context function and directly describes you the transform. Like for example, you literally say that okay, case when user is Prashant, then apply or mask this email. Else when user is anything else, then show me the value as it is, right? The policy can be this, and this can be part of the UDF body. What we can additionally do is 2 things. Like number one, we can leave the current user to the interpretation to the end system. That's one way of defining policy, or we can just evaluate the current user as Prashant and then just give the mask that is corresponding to it because it's a well-defined action. Now, the second thing is that if that requires a join from a mapping table, that okay, if user Prashant is in this particular table, that is a small table, then apply this particular masking policy. For that, we need UDF for sure, because that is entirely SQL execution. So for those cases, I think the one silver bullet is going to be the UDFs in that case, because the thing is that we can't just evaluate those things because it's not just the current user. There are ways to handle this in the expression expansion, but I think that's what we want to go with. So at this point, the phases is like, okay, Ranger has some set of predefined policies or predefined actions. Can we define predefined actions? Now, how do we give that actions back as a result of my policy definition? If my policy is like as simple, like the DDM masking, like I think 90% of the policies for masking fall into this particular criteria for DDM. For row access policy, it is very difficult. If you just resolve the context and just give the predefined action, that will cover that kind of a thing. That's what we want to achieve. But if you want to have a join between a mapping or a entitlement table, then that is going to be very tricky. We can optimize those kind of things by evaluating that join into an inquiry, but that thing which requires join like exist kind of a check might require some UDF references to the expression. So yeah, that's all I have to say. But does it answers your question or the concern that you had on what we are defining when we are saying that, okay, we want to define a transform? It's just like a complementary thing that we want to say that, okay, phase one is this, and then we can expand it. We already want to expand expression referencing UDF for handling the corner cases for Lexis.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much answered the question. So my understanding of three options for all these transform is first condition transform functions of we already have, maybe we want to expand. Another is Iceberg expression expansion, which you can expand to more expressive things to have more functionality. The third one is UDF. Like all three options is kind of more and more expressive and more complex in terms of how user use them, right? How system to define them. If they are complementary, I think it's completely fine to me. They are complementary. Is that fine? Because I'm joining a little bit later for this discussion.
Prashant, you also give a maybe quick 1 minute summary of what we're discussing, since Dan also just shared.
Yeah. Then do you mind if I just summarize on what we discussed in the first half? Yeah. So basically we were discussing about modeling predefined mask as an action, as a defined action versus introducing a new transform for that. So I did some research as part of the last action item, and I did some research on the existing ways of the defined mask on Ranger, MySQL Server, and PG. There are defined masks for them, and they clearly define what that mask mean as an action definition. So we were debating on whether we should have a defined transform for it, or do we need to define an action against it. And engines or things like Iceberg are supposed to implement what if they understand the actions clearly on how they want to implement it. So it felt like there were some good points made by Stephen and Laurent on this one, that it might be worth considering it as a defined transform and then referencing those transform instead of defining it as raw text. And other thing was that we can define a generic transforms page, and then partition transforms can reference to transforms, as well as there can be a fine-grained access control transform that can also reference from that transform. Currently, everything is clubbed into partition transform. Okay. So this was the summary on a high level. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think my initial reaction, I think that this is probably very similar to what I put on the PR, is that conceptually we can define things in different categories, but if we're actually carving out specific meaning for these things separately from just saying that hey, there's actually one way to do this, and drawing a corollary to the UDFs, where we've talked about things hey, there are kind of the well-known ANSI SQL UDFs. We say what that's going to look like, and we expect most people will have a built-in function for it, or they can provide one that has certain specific behavior. I would say that this would be in kind of that category, but the mechanism by which we represent it should really be the same. Why do we need three categories of things when we can represent all of it in one consistent way? And then it's just a matter of hey, do I have that transform or not?
I have an answer to that. So I think there are two categories. I'm not even sure I understood the discussion up to this point for the three categories, and I'm really sorry I was late. But when we looked at moving, at doing this, the original idea was to have an Iceberg transform, or basically an Iceberg expression that transforms a particular column. The problem, I think, with that is that the simple cases become very hard or very confusing and complex. So what you end up with is you need to basically have a bound expression that references the column, and you must be sure that the column that you have this mask for is the column the bound column ID from the expression. So you're adding at least one layer of these things must always match. Next, you have some specific transformation or something else there, and that could take largely any form. So now you have another layer of complexity that we might have two things that in the end mean the same thing, but one system produces that as a UDF that applies all of these functions at the same time. Another just embeds the function calls or transformations explicitly and things like that. So then you have to wrap that whole thing in something that says, oh, and also alias this to the original, to the original column name. So when I was looking at this earlier, it was, we can get rid of a lot of useless complexity by using predefined actions. And an action for a particular field ID means I can give you a clear example of exactly what this produces for a given input. And it also means that it's very, very clear for implementers in different languages, different systems, to know exactly what replace with null means or something like that. So that's, I think, the argument for having a list of predefined actions. And there I would say, yes, we can express those things as transforms, but then you have to do this validation step of making sure that you're bound correctly and whatnot. I would prefer just saying, let's keep this as simple as possible with a handful of predefined transforms, and then have the ability to call out to an Iceberg expression for anything more complicated. But then that is clearly more complicated, requires more validation, and also has implications for the portability of that mask. Laurent?
Yeah, so just trying to summarize. Basically, the argument is that because the implementation in the Iceberg Java side will be more complex, we need to complexify the spec in a way.
No, this is that we want to make the spec very clear. And if you have, I don't know,
I'm just trying to understand because
do this, then do this, then do this. And by the way, these things must match. That is the complexity. It's the complexity of expressing what you want to do to these things, rather than just saying you know what, this is a particular type of mask to apply. I think that those things have a meaningful difference in terms of complexity when different implementations and different things are trying to work with the spec. So I see this as a conceptual simplification of the spec for well-known cases.
Yeah, I think right. You mentioned that if we're going to support the expression transform, then we have to solve the field ID, the binding problem anyway. So unless we're saying we just support the predefined action, no transform.
And I would agree that I'm actually a little confused about what we're actually getting here, because what we would be saying is that for the predefined ones, or the well-known ones, we have behaviors specified, we have potentially names specified so they can be called out consistently. We know what parameters and behaviors are expected. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we need a different mechanism. The way that you would just look that thing up would just be hey, well, this is my set of predefined ones.
Yeah, we don't necessarily need a different mechanism.
Okay.
It's just ugly if you don't use a different mechanism. There's also one case that we thought of where you do require a different mechanism, and that case is when you want to suppress a column, because there's no transformation to produce a different value for a column that actually says, hey, don't show anyone that this column even exists. However, I will also note on that we don't really know if we want column suppression to be in the spec. So I think that one could go either way. This is really just saying it is much, much simpler to say, take column ID 5 and apply this this transformation to it rather than giving a bound expression to apply the same transformation.
Yeah, I think that the question about like column hiding is like a different than this though. Like that, I think we have to have a different mechanism for representing that. It's not an expression.
Well, it could be an action. That's
Could be.
part of the point.
Well, so I kind of question like, and maybe I need to read through this again with that in mind, but if the actions are at a higher level where it's like, hey, one category is things like actions that you take at a table level, like suppressing columns or hiding, descriptions or, whatever it is. But then there's expression actions that are, operating on the actual columnar data, maybe, but.
See, I agree with you. I don't buy that as necessarily a great argument for using actions rather than expressions. I think the problem with expressions is that you have to have it increases or raises the bar for what implementations have to support and understand, right? They need to be able to understand some expression, some generic expression, be able to apply it and so on. Now, maybe that's not so bad. They also need to validate that the service isn't saying like, hey, replace, column ID 1 with column ID 2 and some, mask function on top of that, right? So like, it's just more complexity, more requirements on the engines. And I think it is easier for compatibility everywhere if you say like, okay, this is a well-known alphanumeric mask, apply that mask to this.
But I also see that there are drawbacks there because it can also potentially be limiting because you can't express everything. I can't say, hey,
this is not a replacement for transformations. Right?
Okay.
Like we will need to have transformations and arbitrary expressions, but I think it is far more likely to increase the the number of engines that are at least compliant with the small set of transformations. And so like I would take this trade-off because like then you at least have a set of things that are much more likely to be supported in a trusted engine. And then there's this catch-all for everything else where you do need to do additional work. But it doesn't mean that we don't need expressions. It means that we have a fast and easy path for certain common things. And by the way, I'm fine if we don't go down that path. I understand the benefits of, just make everything an expression.
Yeah, I want to fill in for some more aspects on the Ranger like experience on how this simplifies, like on the actions point of view. Like whenever you see in the Ranger UI, you see a column, you get a drop down of a predefined mask and you just attach that mask. Internally, Ranger takes the responsibility of adding, or Ranger engine plugin takes the responsibility of applying that particular mask for that particular engine if it's supported. The thing is, we can do much more in having kind of a predefined action which clearly states clearly without any ambiguity states what is supposed to do. For example, one example is like, okay, you clearly say that always mask this column. Another is that you have a context function that says that if user is Prashant, then mask this column else this value. You can just run a small compiler which constant folds this value behind your catalog and then just say that, okay, for this column, apply this particular mask, right? Your policy definition can be complex, but your policy results can be very simple. And when the policy results are simple, it's open to the engine on how they want to do. For example, like here, the example I had was by Iceberg and saying that, hey, my policy in the catalog was that if user is Prashant, then apply this particular masking function as false. Then I would just be returning them a masking hash as an action. And if I've clearly defined what that action means, Python can, like PyIceberg can just apply this in whatever way it does. So that also simplifies in a lot of way with context functions, with normal DDM, like normal data masking policies on the way of application rather than opening an expression or waiting for an expression and go ahead. Is an additional thing that I want to add upon. So I think then the question is, given that we have a way like I think we all agree on this thing that we need to have some predefined masks, right? Now the only thing is that how do we define it against? Like, do we need to have defined actions, predefined actions, or do we need predefined transforms? And I mean, I would say that okay, it would be nice if we have predefined actions, in a sense that it will really help if we clearly specify this, that okay, this means that, as long as it's not ambiguous, it can help in adoption of this, and we can have something right away rather than waiting for engine expression referencing the dynamic UDFs. From my research, seems like 90% of what DDMs we have, if we constant fold the context functions, they turn out to be simple masks. So that's one additional data point. I think, I hope if it can help in making that cases. So what does the folks think here? I mean, I think, any thoughts on that? Oh, Lauren, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I'm more aligned with Daniel and Steven in terms of like, if you are adding, I mean, if you already have like the complexity of adding some type of expression engine, or like if you are planning to like introducing something like a stopgap, I don't know. We are getting much like this for having implementing that spec internally or something similar to that spec internally. Like the complexity was not that hard. No, I don't have like I think also one thing which is missing is that we're talking a lot about the engine, but actually like it's an integration between the catalog and more specifically like the authorizer system in the catalog and engines. And the question is like sure, the engines support these things, but like do the catalog, some of them already having like support for FGAC, like prioritization stuff, would be able to provide something which is a predefined actions, or how much for it would be too restrictive for them. If I'm looking at the Laker system, or like for example, like sometimes we have to compare with Unity. Unity is for like generic EDF, so it's free from like Genio Snowflake support also EDF. I think Google has something, BigQuery has something very similar to that. For they also have masking specific masking things. So that's I guess the same discussion we had like 2 weeks ago on like which side will win. Like, is it like like will people see more adoption on the predefined set of actions versus like with like the side of like having like a free form expression being applied to columns. So that's where I am right now.
Yeah, I think one thing I'm not sure. I think Ryan mentioned about the, let's say the action, predefined action versus predefined expression. Like action is easier for the engine to integrate. Is that really much difference? And also because I think Ryan also mentioned about the complexity of serialization or deal with a bounded expression. But if we're going to support the expression, that complexity need to be included anyway.
Yeah, this is like you have to, if you want to support generic expressions, you have to support like the expression syntax. But there probably will be cases where you have something that can run you know, a specific set of masks without necessarily being able to do more than that. And I think that the easiest way to integrate those is not to require them to have an expression parser and then some expression language or interpretation library that can, you know, go figure out what you mean by go get this field, run this transformation, and then produce this value. I think it's easier to express this to, you know, PySpark or whatever else as, hey, this is the mask that I'm running on this function. This is the action that you take. So I think it's just simpler as an implementation. Yeah, simpler for implementations to support. It does not completely eliminate that complexity. It basically creates two classes, right? Things that are well-defined and like reused a lot, and then other more more expressive cases.
Then
Dan?
Oh, Prashant, were you gonna go?
No. Please go ahead. I lowered my hand because whatever I
Yeah.
was going to summarize.
I,
ran already.
yeah, I would just say that I think Ryan described the trade-off at this point pretty well, which is just like, do we want to make a simple path for this? Like the expressions approach should be a superset of all the things that we can do with actions, minus maybe some of the other things which we don't even know if they're actions or not, like column suppression, other types of suppression of other data. I think the question is just like, if we look at the ones that are out there right now, are they sufficiently simple that we don't create this weird scenario where, like, even masking can have complexity. Like you can have like, hey, I want to mask all but the last 3, or just the first, or just the last 4, or I want to mask, but I want to hide how many values there actually are, or I want to mask, but I want to show how many values there are. I want to know, or I want to be able to say like what character I use to replace those things. So like I haven't looked at all of these other implementations and functions, like what are all the things that they allow you to kind of tweak. But if we get to a point where it's like we create 2 classes and they like actually have the same functions that overlap across both of them, I'm not sure that that's worth the additional effort of just implementing, at least a subset of the expression that we can say, hey, here's a limit, like transform as a top level expression. This is what it would look like. And it's a matter of like, hey, do we push a little bit more of towards the complex side to cover everything, or is it really most stuff just fits in that simple scenario?
So there are simple scenarios. Like I gave the example here, right? It is mask versus, and here's the field versus here's an expression. You're going to produce this name. You're going to run this transform and pull data from this particular thing. This comes down to like, I would compare it to timestamp types. There are timestamp types where you have like milliseconds and then nanoseconds as separate fields. And that seems incredibly easy. Like, oh, if you're over 1,000 in if you're over 1,000,000 in your nanoseconds field, you increment the other one. And then, but when you're actually reading this from disk, right, you actually have to interpret things when people do, when people violate the rules. So if we were to have this second case where I'm saying, hey, transform ID one, field ID 1, and here's an expression that references field ID 2, we have to define like what engines have to do in that case. We also have to define, we also have to account for what's going to happen if engines just allow it, right? Like if I say, hey, replace field ID 1 with this transformation of field ID 2, do we allow that? Are we okay with engines allowing that? It creates a lot more questions. Whereas I prefer the simple approach of saying like, you know what, a nanosecond timestamp is going to be more limited in what it can express until we actually have an int 192, or sorry, 120, int 128, int 192. That was yeah. So that's my preference. But I think that we all understand the trade-offs. It's probably best if we just go, think about it and come back with where we land on this. And that's probably a dev list thread. I don't know. Kevin, sorry.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me. I was just gonna talk about the list of things that we wanted to talk about. And I think this is, Prashant, if you can go back to the doc. Essentially, we hit number 2, right? Like, can we take a phased approach of being transform expression and expand it later? And I think, I don't know if Prashant, if you want to sum it up or someone else wants to sum up the discussion, but I think we did a lot of work to answer this question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the way I was thinking about is that, there are policy stores such as like, Ranger, there are policy stores such as that of lake formation, for example. I'm not saying that these are the best of the policy stores, but they can operate with what we have at this point of time. Their expression support is very basic. Can we build incrementally on top of it? Like this is the phase one. This is where the structure of what the read restriction is going to look like. Currently, these are terms. Later, they can refer. Currently, these are actions. Now, the actions can reference to an expression, which can tell you what transformation you need to apply for your very complex masking policies that requires joins or anything. At the same time, same goes with the row access policies. But at this point, considering what transforms we have, what actions we have, and what are the simple expressions we can define in row access policies, can we take a phased approach in which we get the structure in and then build upon and keep on making progress on the phase two, where we expand the expression to reference UDF, because I'm assuming that UDF REST protocol is also something we'll need to have. Then I think dialect discussion is something that is unavoidable, but it will come. That okay, what is the dialect when you're enforcing policy? So these are more grounds to cover when we talk about UDFs. Can we take a phased approach? Is one thing I want to know what people think in this call.
Yeah, I guess we're I put the is this a good next step? It's almost like a phased approach, right? Like, can we use this example as a like, let's do this first.
Yeah.
Like let's do like define all the pieces of how to make the mask alpha num work. I know it's an example, but like something along that shape, right? Like there's
You mean like define all the cases of things that we actually want to produce, like the transforms? Because we need to do that either way.
sure.
Like whether we express it as a transform or use the syntactic sugar of action,
Yeah.
we need to define the set of things that we expect everything to support. Because part of this is if we just say, hey, it can be a generic expression, you're going to have zero portability until you hit UDFs.
Yeah.
So like I think we do need to do what you're saying, Kevin. If I understand you correctly, saying like, what are the common transformations and masks, and what do we want in this small set of things that we expect everyone to support?
Yeah, I think I was mentioning more in terms of like depth versus breadth, right? Like depth as in like, what do we need to support this in every step, and then breadth is like, what are all of the or functions that we should support. So both.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we discussed that like in the first half of the meeting, Brian. Like I mean, like I'm like Kevin. I want like potentially like a few set of expression over like trying to cover and boil the whole ocean. And so I would be okay with just having like the existing transform we have like in the invertible spec, and plus like maybe like the few like the SHA and the thing which are like the two which I mentioned in the spec, and let's start with that. I'm also afraid of like if we start discussing which one we need to add, then people will come and say, oh, like we need to add like this one and this one because that's thing and stuff. And like if you want me like if you care about like a phase approach, let's start with something like a small core, and let's see how we evolve from here.
Yeah, I think that we can come up with a small set. I think that it would be too restrictive to say like Iceberg existing like transforms from Iceberg metadata.
And I say like the one which are like in both the spec and the press Iceberg transform, because like they like Iceberg transform has like void and identity, like things like which we also wanted like in the GAC as like rare use cases, but like the SHA thing is not there, and like I think it was like the alphanium stuff, and like
yeah, I think that we need to figure out which expressions are required, and I would not actually just assume that we want even all of the partition transforms, because I don't think that partition transforms and masks are overlapping 100%.
Some are, not all, maybe. I mean, some are not that useful as masking, but I agree.
Yeah, I mean, for the bucket transforms, that makes sense. For example, we don't need transforms like bucket transform. I don't know if there is an existing mask of a system with that sort. But taking a step back again, are we saying that we will research on more what such functions look like and go to devlist to have like better, like more opinion on what that should be? But we are okay with doing the phased approach while we come up with something simple for phase one, and then for phase two, we will keep on expanding on the UDFs. Brian, Dan. Is
I
it
mean,
fair to summarize in that way?
I think that the next thing we want to do is, I agree, get more concrete. So why don't we decide what transformations we want in an initial set,
Mhm.
define what that would look like in both cases, and bring that to the dev list and say, like, here are concrete examples of choice A versus choice B. These two things are equivalent, but do we think that, restricting to a set of actions that does or does not include run some expression is going to be, something that we want to do. I think that is, those are the two dimensions that I think we need to explore. What transformations do we need to be able to run for masking? And do we want to express those as expressions or actions?
That makes sense. I can take an action item on that and follow up on the dev list. Cool. I think we are out of time. So thank you so much, everyone. I'll send, as usual, the meeting notes. Really appreciate you taking time here. Yeah.
Thanks.
Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.